Bienvenidos todos. Este es una tertulia que haremos en inglés muy internacional en colaboración con UNAM China y que va a tratar sobre todas las oportunidades y los retos de la cinematografía durante tiempos de pandemia. Welcome everybody. My name is Benjamin Juarez. I'm the director of the Center for Mexican Studies of the National Autonomous University of Mexico in Boston, Massachusetts, located at UMass Boston. And it's wonderful to welcome really a constellation of filmmakers and film professors and scholars from 3 countries, from Mexico, the United States, and the People's Republic of China. And in order to guide us through this conversation, I would like to give the floor to Pablo Mendoza, a filmmaker who graduated from the National School of Cinematography Arts of the National Autonomous University of Mexico, and also of the National School of Languages and Linguistics of UNAM. He's fluent in Chinese, and he studied also still photography. He has had some wonderful films, starting with his thesis project, Everlasting Red, that was nominated for the Ariel Awards. And he became the first Latin American to graduate from the directing department in 2010 from the Beijing Film Academy. So, Pablo, the floor is yours. And just let me welcome Professor Roberto Moracatlet from UNAM and from CCC in Mexico, Professor Sarah Keller from UMass Boston, and Professor Wang Li, who is the Director of Art and Cinema, Film and TV Department at the Shanghai Film Academy, and also the founder of the Shanghai Berkeley Film Center. Welcome, everybody.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Professor Juarez. Welcome, everybody, to today's program, Perspectives of Cinematography in Times of Pandemic, organized by the Representation Office of the National Autonomous University of Mexico in Boston and Beijing. I would like to thank the directors Benjamin Juarez, director of UNAM Boston, and Guillermo Pulido, director of UNAM China, as well our prestigious guest, Professor Wang Li from the Film Academy of Shanghai University. In fact, both universities, UNAM and Shanghai University, just signed an agreement of collaboration. Professor Sarah Keller from the University of Massachusetts and Professor Juan Mora from the National School of Film Arts of UNAM. Thanks for all your support to make this event happen. First of all, let me introduce our very VIP guests before we start our conversation. Professor Wang Li is Director of Film and Television Department of Shanghai Film Academy, Doctoral Supervisor, Executive Editor of Film Theoretical Research, Director of Shanghai Berkeley Film and Media Research Center, and leading researcher of film science. In 2009, she received her PhD in film science from Shanghai University. In 2011, Professor Huang worked as a visiting scholar at the University of California and participated in academic exchanges at the University of Illinois, the University of South Carolina, the University of Hawaii, and the University of Cork in Ireland. At present, she is mainly involved in the following research fields: Chinese film history, Chinese film policy and strategy research, etc. Recently, she has presided over and completed a national social science and art project, and won two scientific research projects on provincial and ministerial level in 2017. From the Ministry of Education of China and the National Radio and Television Administration. Professor Sarah Keller is Associate Professor of Art and Cinema Studies at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. She is the founder and director of the Boston Cinema Media Seminar, a collective of local scholars and visiting presenters working on research in cinema and media studies. Her research focused on experimental form, film experience, and feminist issues in cinema. Her most recent book, Anxious Cinephilia, published by Columbia University Press in 2020, centers on the intertwined role of love and anxiety in encounters with cinema. She is currently completing a book on the career of experimental filmmaker and artist Barbara Hammer, forthcoming in the next year for Wayne State University Press Queer Screen Series. Professor Juan Mora Catlet has showcased the indigenous world in a unique way with his features Return to Aztlán and Erendira Ikikunari, which have received several awards in Mexico and abroad. His latest feature, Anger, also known as Seol, S-H-E-O-L, deals with his experience as a cancer survivor, combining fiction and documentary. He has been a John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur and John S. Guggenheim Foundation's Fellow and a member of Mexico Sistema Nacional de Creadores de Arte. He's a full professor of the National School of Film Arts at UNAM and teaches at the Center for Film Training, CCC. In fact, the Film Academy of UNAM and the Center for Film Training, CCC, are the most important film academies in Mexico. He recently received the Lifetime Educational Achievement Award from the International Association of Film and Television Schools, SELECT, composed by 180 schools of 5 continents. It's really a big honor to have the three of you in today's program. And well, the first question is about one of the essences of cinema. Like Andrei Tarkovsky defines it as sculpting in time. And sculpting in time is talking about memory, the way we recall past times in order to not forget. I think that's why memory is so important to humankind. And talking about this catastrophe caused by COVID-19, when it started in the province of Hubei and its capital, the city of Wuhan, the first ones to record this memory were writers like Fang Fang, now published in her Diary of Wuhan, and also by what we called in Western world YouTubers that were filming a series of events and interviewing people during the beginning of the pandemic in China. For many other artists and filmmakers, it will take maybe years to start talking about this matter. For example, when Chernobyl's disaster happened in 1986 of the past century, it took to the journalist and Nobel Prize winner Svetlana Alexievich 20 years after the accident to start writing and interviewing people that was involved or was victim of one of the biggest accidents of humankind in the 20th century. Now that we are facing probably the worst crisis of 21st century caused by this terrible virus, from a social perspective on your own countries, what do you think it will be or are now approached the pandemic topics on cinema? We give the floor to Professor Sarah Keller.
Thank you. And I just want to express my own thanks for the invitation to join this formidable group of people from around the world talking about these same issues. I'm mostly excited because I want to hear about how these issues compare in different parts of the world. And, you know, how is it that the pandemic is reflected in movies, which, you know, was your question about memory and documenting and thinking through the sort of scope of something that's so hard to get our heads around as we're experiencing it. And I point to something like the phenomenon of the movie, the Steven Soderbergh movie Contagion, which you may have heard on March 15th, which was about a week into all the closures in the United States, 1 week. It jumped from number 270 on the iTunes popularity, like how many people were renting it that week, to number 2 in that 1 week, because I think people want to see issues like this that are very hard to, again, get your head around, reflected in the art that we have in the world too. You know, there's a meme going around that says something like, you know, science will, you know, be the cure for this, but art is the answer in the meantime. And I feel like that's absolutely true and powerful. And I think, you know, we need films like Contagion, something that is fictionalized, because it sort of has this ritual effect where we are able to sort of imaginatively project ourselves into a fictional narrative in order to process the things that we're experiencing in the everyday. To answer your question about, you know, memory, I think 20 years is about right. You know, when you were talking about Chernobyl and it takes about 20 years, they say that most sort of major historical events don't get a lot of sort of artistic treatment until about a generation later. It takes that long for there to be a kind of outcropping of reflections on it. But at the same time, I've noticed in the US anyway, on a very local level, there are a number of organizations that are asking amateur and professional filmmakers and other kinds of artists, writers especially, to submit their memories on film, their photographs, you know, of being in quarantine, of, you know, celebrating the holidays in quarantine, to sort of make sure that there's an archive of materials that relate to this moment. When the pandemic broke out, I was teaching a class called Documentary Moving Images, and it was half sort of studying the history of documentary and then half making our own work. And all of the students turned to what was closest to them around them, because that's all that they had, right? Like they couldn't go out into the city. They couldn't go find their friends and film with them. So it became this really lovely study of the things that were very closest and more quiet around them. And I think that that's one of the effects of the pandemic, that it's forced all of us to pay closer attention to the smaller things, to the minutia of our daily lives, and to find, you know, pleasures and joys in those things as well. So I think, you know, it will be a long process for people, you know, memorializing the pandemic, but I think that process is already underway.
Thank you very much, Professor Keller. It's very interesting that you mentioned the movie of Contagion, and it was really impressive because even in China, in the because, you know, in China they have their own streaming platforms, no, that are very different from the Western world, and even the movie of Steven Soderbergh became like one of the most seen movies during that period. And I saw the movie in that moment. It was like in February. In those times, it seems like a little far away from this reality when I saw the movie. But if you watch the movie again, in fact, is what we are living nowadays maybe already surpassed what Steven Soderbergh is portraying in his movie. And I really think another very interesting part of that movie is that I think it was shot like, I don't know, maybe you can tell us, like 10 years before this pandemic. I don't know.
Yeah, at least 10 years. Yeah, I can't remember the date, but yeah, it's way before. It has nothing to do with, you know, sort of any specific true pandemic. It's not reflecting, you know, a specific one. The Host is another one that I just rewatched, the Bong Joon-ho film, The Host, which, you know, also, I didn't realize that it was going to be about that. And then people are wearing masks and someone sneezes into a puddle and then a car goes by and splashes and everybody freaks out, because it's really about, fears of contagion. Yeah, they're everywhere. Those films they're in imaginative terrain again, but they precede this pandemic. Yeah.
Yes. And the other topic that you taught us is about how we start using our own mediums, like our cell phones, because in fact, nowadays you can make a movie with your cell phone, and that's exactly what started happening during this period. Now we use our own tools to record what was happening. Well, thank you very much, Professor Keller. Now I give the floor to Professor Juan Mora.
Thank you. Well, in Mexico, the pandemic started really in March when everything was closed down, was shut down. The advice was to stay at home, which provoked many kinds of crises. One of the worst crises is the increment of unemployment, mainly young people under 29 years old and women that usually in Mexico have the worst working conditions than the rest of the population. So there was a lot of people let off because they didn't have any contracts, they don't have any social security. They're in the informal sector, and many times they're working without pay because they receive tips from the customers. So this pandemic has provoked that about 16 million people fell into extreme poverty by their earnings, according to a study by our university. The pandemic didn't bring unevenness to Mexico. Maybe it just made it more visible. These are themes that have to be treated as an emergency because we're still in an emergency. That's like the general view of the situation. Of course, this affected terribly the film industry as theaters had to close up. Our largest two Mexican film exhibition companies, which are Cinemex and Cinépolis, which has become an international company. They were even going to buy, I don't know, hundreds of theaters in Brazil, but they stopped because they couldn't go on, and they were closing theaters in Mexico because of the pandemic. Also, the film production almost stopped. There are very few films continuing being shot, and films that took as a theme the pandemic are very few. On one side, there is an interesting, curious fact because in 2016, film shot with the title "Not a Minute to Waste," and then when it opened in 2019, they changed the name to "Would Have Exists," deals with the prediction of the pandemic. In this film, which is a romantic comedy, science fiction romantic comedy, there was a scene where a character from the future arrives to advise a woman that she should not continue her relationship with his boyfriend because in 2020, 4 years after this film was filmed, there would be a virus very much like a flu that would kill a lot of people. That's one of the interesting things. At this point, there are several films being shot on the theme. There was one that started as a documentary produced by Estrella Medina, who from the first day of the quarantine started to gather information to make a documentary known as, or titled Mexico Vid-19, and then she decided to turn it into a docufiction. So she started shooting under the most strict sanitary measures in locations in the state of Mexico, and gave it the new title, Instance. It's about a young guy who comes to the capital of Mexico to study filmmaking, but he didn't think the pandemic would start. So that makes him, as many millions of people on the planet, to stay in an apartment where he lives and be far away from his mother and grandmother who live in the Michoacan state. The crew really has the minimum elements to make this shooting because they have to use all the protection measures, which has increased the budgets of filmmaking from a 20 to a 40%, which is one of the biggest problems in continuing filmmaking in our country, because you cannot shoot without these measures. Other efforts have been by the Filmoteca of the university, the Film Archives of the Mexico's National University, where there's a pandemic diary in a channel, YouTube channel, in which people contribute with very, very short films, and many 3 minutes long, about their experiences, daily experiences in the pandemic. There's a project by Casals that looking for financing, the Procine of the Mexico City, which is like institution that promotes filmmaking and distribution. They even have a festival, are making a documentary from the perspective of the government of the city. There are about 2 or 3 feature films being made. So there's sort of this, I don't know, first it's a shock, and then there's a need to record what's going on. I think we're still inside the woods. We don't see the whole panorama. And maybe this material being gathered in the future will be able to compose some sort of witness account of this whole process that is changing, completely changing our way, not only of making film, but of living. So that's more or less the situation regarding this first question.
Thanks very much, Professor Mora. I think the National University has made a remarkable job in the way they are calling to people, not only from Mexico, but from around the world, to register what is happening. You talk us about the diary of the pandemia, organized by the Film Archive of UNAM, and we also here at UNAM China, we give diffusion to this calling. And also here at the representation office of UNAM, we also make a calling to the students of Spanish here in China to write about their experiences in the beginning of the outbreak. And in fact, we went to make a presentation of these writings, of these essays, next year in February, because there's a very special date that marked the beginning of this pandemic. That was the night of the 22nd of February. That it was the date that was locked down Wuhan. Well, now we give the floor to Professor Huang from Shanghai University.
Generally, I have a PowerPoint for us for this conversation. From the July 6th, the National Film Administration issued a notice saying that on the premise of the effective implementation of various prevention and control measures for cinemas. Low-risk area can resume business ordinarily in July 2020. Media and highly risk areas will not be open for business temporarily. So here we can find the theaters hope to prepare our audience come to back to the theaters. So we right now generally we can go to the theater to watch movie. So here is the beginning of the theater is moving or theaters is open the situation here, but here is also some control regulations. So here is those two do not wear masks and whose body temperature is about 27.3 degree are not allowed to the entered theaters. So generally one room, 20% seats should be used. Food and drink are generally forbidden in the cinema. No more than 2 hours per films. So per movies exhibit. Another problem is debate causes by the loss in Russia. So Russia, here is the problem is of talking about the protester from theater. So I talking about before. So and another business problem is that movie Lost in Russian sold the internet copyright for the 600 million renminbi. So it's hard to change, almost $100 million. That company, that company which is to produce this Lost in Russian, this movie, we call it 欢喜 Media, 欢喜传媒. Here is a 欢喜 Media Group. The corporation that fuels both production investment and the new media platform. The influence of the Beijing online, so I mentioned before, is protest from the theater chain. Academic scholars pay more attention on these changes of film distribution. There is a lot discussed on internet so hope to find the relations related to those this debate related to the support from the Netflix and the imitation to it. So that's the we hope to talking about more about this information. So here is we find the postal code area, the production films about the pandemic in China. This is another problem. I think I just talking about that. Let me talking about it later. Okay, sorry about that.
Thank you very much. Very interesting presentation of the situation now in China in the exhibition field. Well, let me continue with the next. The second and the third question are about the cinematography activities, about the work of cinema in this new reality. But before asking the questions, I would like to talk about different perspectives, because the way China has dealt with the pandemic is very different from the approach approach made by US and Mexico, and the way the outbreak is controlled, the way it will affect in film production. For example, the work that China has done to control the epidemic is really remarkable, and I would say admirable. They have spent millions in the control and prevention of the pandemic, as well as the millions of tests that are made when they detect only a few cases. For example, in the last weeks, some cases were detected in Shanghai and in other cities of different provinces in China. But when we talk of few cases in China, we are talking about 10 cases, 15, and then they will test thousands of people that were close or nearby those infected ones. The lockdowns of compounds, districts, or even entire cities we saw at the beginning of the outbreak between January and March in Hubei province and in other cities, including Beijing, during the second wave in June. Geolocator softwares on our smartphones that can reveal if you have been in contact with an infected person. Theaters began to open in the summer in China, as Professor Huang told us in her presentation. In the beginning with a capacity of 30%, in July 50%, and in September the capacity of the audience reached to the 75% until nowadays. The most important of all these controls is that jobs in China are back to normal, including film productions. Unlike many other countries where drastic measures have not been taken to control the outbreak, including Mexico and the United States. So, taking this into consideration, how does the pandemic has affected the production and exhibition of films in China, Mexico, and the United States? And which are the strategies or mechanisms, if there are, to restart the production and exhibition of films? Maybe Professor Sarah Keller, you can start talking about the situation in US, then Professor Juan Mora. Professor Huang already explained us the actual situation of the production and the exhibition in China. Thank you. Please, Professor Keller.
Sure. Yeah, I know just a little about this in the US, so I'll keep my remarks fairly short. There has been production happening, but on a very small scale. So, for example, this week we saw images of Jennifer Lawrence and Leonardo DiCaprio in the South Station terminal for the train station, both wearing masks and waving to people, and in a very small crew, that all is in a kind of bubble. So exactly as you've said, there have not been the same kinds of restrictions in the United States. And so the pandemic is really raging out of control at the moment. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if, productions that have started again, and there are not that many of them, but it is happening, but in these sort of controlled environments, where people agree to, basically quarantine with their crew and not their families for periods of time, which can only, be horrible for everyone involved, and much shorter filming schedules. But those are, starting to open up a little bit more, or they have been opening up a little bit more after having been basically completely shut down, at least in the Boston and New York scenes. And as I said, I wouldn't be at all surprised if those get shut down again in the midst of, renewed spikes in the pandemic, where it's really not particularly safe, to be out among the public making films. So, and then just the one other thing that I would say about production, I know we'll talk a little bit about exhibition next, but the other element of production that I think is something that we should just be thinking about for the future as we predict what might happen next is the size of these productions and what it facilitates and what it doesn't facilitate. There has been in the almost 8 or 9 months or so that the pandemic has been asserting itself, there's been a rise in production of of documentary features more so than fiction features, which is a really interesting trend because they require smaller crews. And I think this has, this has the potential to have a lasting impact on the industry, either documentary as a genre or fiction features that are much smaller in scale. So again, I won't talk about exhibition yet, but the kinds of very large films like, the superhero franchises and all of the franchises, those are extremely large scale productions, and they will have and have had more difficulty continuing production because of the nature of the kind of production that they are. And I wonder if that will have a lasting impact on the industry.